My son-in-law didn't just laugh when his mother humiliated my daughter in front of 300 wedding guests. He raised his champagne glass like she'd given a toast. That's the moment I knew the man my Lily had married was every bit the monster I'd suspected, and that the 7 years I'd spent quietly preparing for this exact betrayal were about to pay off in ways none of them could imagine. My name is Walter. I'm 68 years old, a retired structural engineer from Pittsburgh, and I spent 41 years building bridges across rivers people said couldn't be crossed. I know a thing or two about load-bearing weight, about what holds and what collapses, about the difference between something that looks solid and something that actually is. I've also been a single father since my wife Diane passed in 2011 when Lily was just 15 years old. So when I tell you that watching my only child stand at the front of that ballroom holding a folded gray apron with her name embroidered on it, while her brand new husband threw his head back and laughed, I want you to understand that pain didn't break me. It confirmed something I had known in my bones for a very long time. Let me back up. Lily met Brennan Whitlock Crowley at a charity gala in Boston during her second year of medical residency. She was 26. He was 31, an investment banker from one of those old New England families that owns half of Beacon Hill and refers to their summer home as the cottage, even though it has 9 bedrooms. I met him for the first time at Thanksgiving in 2023. He shook my hand too firmly, called me Walt within 10 minutes of meeting me, and made a joke about how Pittsburgh must be charming in its own gritty way. I smiled. I poured him a beer, and that night, after he and Lily went to bed in the guest room, I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee gone cold, and I knew the way you know when a bridge is going to fail before the inspectors say so. Something in the way he looked at my daughter, like she was a beautiful piece of property he'd acquired at auction, like she was a credential. But Lily was 30 years old and head over heels, and the happiest I'd seen her since her mother died. So I kept my mouth shut. I kept my mouth shut at Christmas when his mother, Cordelia, asked Lily what country club she'd grown up at, and actually laughed out loud when Lily said her father had taught her to swim at the YMCA. I kept my mouth shut at the engagement party in their Newport house when Brennan's father, Whitlock Crowley III, asked me what I thought of the current state of the trades like I was a plumber instead of a man who had built infrastructure for 3 different state governments. I kept my mouth shut and I started planning, because here's what nobody tells you about being a father. By the time you see the danger your daughter is in, it's usually too late to talk her out of it. So your job becomes something different. Your job becomes building her a way out brick by brick before she even knows she's going to need one. The first thing I did 2 weeks after that Thanksgiving in 2023 was call my attorney, Marcus Brennan. No relation, just a nasty coincidence. Marcus and I went to Penn State together in the 70s. He's handled my affairs since Diane died. I told him I wanted to set up an irrevocable trust in Lily's name, just hers, sole beneficiary, protected from any spouse, current or future, under any circumstance, divorce, separation, coercion, joint debt, the works. Marcus pushed back at first. He said, "Walt, are you sure? This kid hasn't even proposed yet." I said, "Marcus, I've been around long enough to know what I'm looking at. Draft the papers." Over the next 3 years, I funded that trust quietly. I sold my second property, a little fishing cabin up near Lake Erie that Diane and I had bought when Lily was in elementary school. I cashed out a portion of my 401k and took the tax hit. I sold my late father's coin collection, which I'd been saving for Lily's own children someday. I told myself those grandchildren weren't going to need coins. They were going to need a mother who could walk out the door. By the time the wedding rolled around in October of 2025, that trust held just under $2 million in cash and conservative bond funds, plus the deed to a fully paid-off 2-bedroom condominium in the Back Bay neighborhood of Boston, 15 minutes from the hospital where Lily worked. I bought it the previous spring under an LLC owned by the trust. Furnished it myself with help from my sister Patricia. On 3 weekend trips, I told Lily were engineering consulting jobs. She never knew. None of them knew. The wedding was held at the Whitlock Crowley Estate in Newport, Rhode Island, on a Saturday in early October. 300 guests, white tents on the lawn that overlooked the Atlantic, a string quartet during cocktail hour, then a 12-piece swing band for the reception. Cordelia had insisted on planning every detail herself. Lily had told me, with that tight smile she'd started wearing more and more often, that it was easier to just let her have her way. I'd nodded. I'd helped her into the dress my wife had picked out for her when she was 17 years old, a simple ivory silk gown Diane had ordered from a seamstress in Pittsburgh 6 months before her diagnosis, with a handwritten note tucked into the garment bag that said, "For my Lily, on the happiest day of her life. Love, Mom." Lily wore that dress, and I walked her down the aisle. The ceremony itself was fine. Brennan said his vows like he was closing a business deal. Lily's hands shook when she said hers. I noticed. I always notice. The reception was where it happened. After dinner, after the cake, Cordelia took the microphone from the band leader. She was wearing a champagne-colored gown that probably cost more than my first house, and she had this smile on her face that I'd seen before. At the engagement party, at the rehearsal dinner, a smile that always preceded something cruel dressed up as a joke. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about how proud she was of her darling boy. And then she said, "Now, before we send the happy couple off, I have one final gift for my new daughter-in-law. A welcome gift from our family to hers." She gestured, and one of the servers brought up a large white box tied with a navy blue ribbon. Lily was sitting at the head table next to Brennan. I was at the table directly to her left, with my sister Patricia and my brother-in-law Don. I watched my daughter's face as she untied the ribbon. I watched her lift the lid. Inside the box was a folded gray cotton apron with white piping, a pair of black orthopedic shoes, a small leather notebook, and on top, a laminated card titled Daily Household Duties, wife of Brennan Whitlock Crowley. Lily stared at it. The room got quiet. 300 people watching her. Cordelia took the microphone again and said, "And I want you to hear this exactly as I heard it. Welcome to the family, sweetheart. Now we'll find out what you're really worth." And then my son-in-law, my brand new son-in-law, the man who had just promised in front of God and 300 witnesses to love and cherish my only child for the rest of her life, raised his champagne glass, looked at his mother, looked at his bride, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Perfect, Mom. She's going to need that. Lord knows the residency hours don't teach a woman how to keep a house." He laughed. His father laughed. His 3 brothers laughed. About a third of the room laughed. The third that were Whitlock Crowley relations and friends. The other 2/3 went silent. My side of the family mostly. Lily's friends from medical school. A few of the kinder servers even who looked away. And my daughter, my brilliant, brave, exhausted daughter, who had finished in the top 3% of her class at Johns Hopkins, who had worked 80-hour weeks during her residency, who had just hours ago promised her life to this man in front of everyone she loved. My daughter started to cry, quietly, the way she'd cried at her mother's funeral, trying to hide it, trying to be polite. I stood up. I want to tell you what was going through my head in that moment, because I think it matters. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that. I was past anger. Anger is what you feel when something unexpected happens. This wasn't unexpected. This was the bridge collapsing exactly when and where I'd calculated it would. 3 years before, on a cold November night at my kitchen table, what I felt standing up at that table in that white tent in Newport was something closer to relief. The waiting was over. I walked to the front of the room. I didn't rush. I'd worn my best suit, the charcoal one Diane had picked out for me at Brooks Brothers in 2008. For our 30th anniversary, I'd carried a leather portfolio under my arm all evening. Nobody had asked about it. People assume an old man carrying a folder at his daughter's wedding is going to give a speech, and they're usually right. I took the microphone from Cordelia. She handed it to me with a strange, twitching smile. I think part of her thought I was going to play along, that I was going to make a joke about my daughter learning to cook, give my blessing to the apron, smooth it over. I turned to face the room. My wife, Diane, died 14 years ago, I said. Lily was 15. The last conversation I had with her mother in the hospital was about our daughter. Diane made me promise 3 things. The first was that I would make sure Lily finished her education. The second was that I would never remarry unless I found someone who loved Lily as much as she did. The third, and this was the last thing she said to me before the morphine took her, was that I would never, under any circumstances, let anyone treat our daughter as less than what she was. She made me swear on her hand. I swore. I paused. 300 people watching me now. Cordelia's smile gone. Brennan looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between annoyance and confusion. Lily, sweetheart, would you come up here, please? She did, slowly, still holding the box. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. She stood next to me, and I could feel her shaking, and I put my hand on her shoulder the way I had at her mother's graveside. I have a wedding gift for you, too, I said. I've been working on it for a while. I opened the portfolio. Inside was a manila envelope, sealed with her full name written across it in Diane's handwriting, Lillian Margaret Hayes. I'd had Diane's old grocery list scanned years ago, and I'd asked a calligrapher friend to match her handwriting for this. It was the only forgery I've ever committed in my life, and I do not regret it. I handed her the envelope. Open it, honey. Read it out loud. She fumbled with the seal. The room was completely silent now. Even the band had stopped pretending to fuss with their instruments. Lily pulled out the documents, 3 of them, paper-clipped together, and her eyes started moving across the first page, and I watched her face change. She looked up at me. Daddy. Read it, sweetheart, out loud, so everyone can hear. She took a breath. Her voice was shaky at first, but it got steadier. The Hayes Family Trust, she read. Established November 12, 2023. Solely and exclusive beneficiary, Lillian Margaret Hayes. Trustee, Walter David Hayes. Current trust assets, $1,942,000 in cash and bond holdings, plus real property located at. She stopped. She looked up at me. Her eyes were enormous. Daddy, what is this? Keep going, honey. Real property located at 142 Marlborough Street, Unit 4B, Boston, Massachusetts. 2-bedroom condominium, title held by Hayes Trust, LLC. Fully paid. No liens. She was crying again now, but it was different. Special provisions. Trust assets are irrevocably protected from any current or future spouse of the beneficiary. No portion of trust principal or income may be commingled with marital property. No spouse may be granted access, signatory authority, or beneficial interest under any circumstance, including but not limited to divorce, legal separation, joint petition, or coercion. In the event of dissolution of marriage, all trust assets remain the sole property of the beneficiary. She lowered the papers. She looked at me. I had never loved her more than in that moment. There's a third document, I said quietly. Look at it. She flipped to the third page. She read it silently, her lips moving. Then she made a small sound, half a laugh, half a sob, and she pressed the papers to her chest. What is that one, Lily? I asked, even though I knew. I wanted Cordelia to hear it. It's a 1-page summary, she said. Her voice was getting stronger now. It's titled Escape Plan. It has a phone number for a divorce attorney in Boston. It has the address of the condo. It has a key. It says. She looked up. She looked at Brennan. She looked at Cordelia. It says, you have a home. You have money that is yours alone. You have a lawyer who is paid for. You have a father who is one phone call away 24 hours a day for the rest of his life. You do not ever have to stay anywhere you are not loved. I want you to picture Cordelia Whitlock Crowley's face in that moment. I want you to picture the color draining out of it. I want you to picture Brennan setting down his champagne glass very slowly, like the glass had suddenly become heavy. I want you to picture his father standing up at the head table. I want you to picture 300 wedding guests staring at this family, this perfect, ancient, untouchable New England family, and realizing for the first time, all at once, what was actually in front of them. Brennan stood up. "Walt," he said. His voice had an edge in it I'd never heard before. "Walt, this is wildly inappropriate. This is our wedding. You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want," I said, calmly, into the microphone. "She's my daughter. She'll be my daughter until the day I die. Your name on her marriage license doesn't change that. And before you say another word, son, I want you to understand something. I'm a retired structural engineer. I spent 4 decades being paid by the United States government to look at things and tell people whether they were going to hold up. I looked at you, Brennan. I looked at your mother. I looked at this family 3 years ago, and I knew." I turned back to Lily. I touched her cheek the way I had when she was small. "You don't have to do anything tonight, sweetheart. You can stay if you want. You can think about it. You can go on the honeymoon. The trust is there either way. The condo is there either way. I am there either way. But I want you to know, right now, in front of every person who loves you and every person who doesn't, you have a choice. You have always had a choice. You have always had a choice. You will always have a choice. Your mother and I made sure of it." Lily was sobbing now. Real, racking sobs. The kind I hadn't heard from her since Diane's funeral. She put her arms around my neck. She buried her face in my shoulder. And then, into my collar, I heard her whisper, "Get me out of here, Daddy. Please, get me out of here right now." I looked over her head at Brennan. "My daughter is leaving," I said. "Don't follow us." What happened next, I learned about in pieces over the following weeks. Brennan tried to grab Lily's arm as we walked out of the tent. My nephew Casey, Patricia's youngest, 24 years old, 6'4", a former offensive lineman at West Virginia, stepped between them and said something very quietly that I have never asked about. Brennan let go. Casey walked us to my car. Patricia and Dawn followed in theirs. We drove straight to the condo in Boston, 3 hours in the dark. Lily slept the whole way. When we got to Marlborough Street at 2 in the morning, she walked through the front door, looked around at the furniture and the books on the shelves and the photo of her mother I'd hung in the entryway, and she sat down on the floor in her wedding dress, and she laughed and laughed and laughed until she started crying again. The next morning, Cordelia called my cell phone 17 times. I didn't answer. I made my daughter scrambled eggs and toast in her own kitchen in her own home in a city where I had quietly prepared a life for her 3 years before she knew she was going to need one. We didn't talk about the wedding. We talked about her mother. We looked through Diane's old recipe box, which I'd brought up the previous spring and stocked in the kitchen drawer. The annulment papers were filed on Tuesday. Brennan tried to fight it for about 2 weeks until his own attorney apparently took one look at my prenuptial documentation and told him to walk away. The Whitlock Crowleys had insisted on a prenup, naturally. I had insisted on amendments. Their lawyers had agreed to mine because they didn't think we'd ever need them. Funny how that works. The marriage was legally void within 41 days. Now I want to tell you about 2 things that I didn't expect. The first is that Brennan had a younger sister. Her name was Mallory. She was 23 years old, and the only Whitlock Crowley who had been kind to Lily from the beginning. She'd pulled Lily aside at the rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding and tried to tell her something, and Lily had brushed her off because she was too overwhelmed to listen. Mallory had been trying to warn her about their mother, about what their mother did to wives, about what had happened to their oldest brother's first wife, who had left in the middle of the night 3 years earlier and had never spoken to any of them again. 3 months after the wedding, Mallory called Lily. She apologized for not pushing harder. She said she'd been trying to leave the family for years, but didn't know how. She'd been told her trust fund was contingent on family loyalty. She didn't have her own home. She was 23 years old and she was trapped in exactly the same kind of cage that had nearly closed around my daughter. Lily called me. We talked for 2 hours. And then I called Marcus Brennan again, and we set up a second trust. Smaller. Mallory wasn't my daughter after all, but enough. Enough for first and last month's rent on an apartment in Boston. Enough for 2 years of community college tuition while she figured out what she wanted to do. Enough for a car. Enough for a fresh start. Lily insisted. I would have done it anyway. Mallory moved in with Lily for a few weeks while she got on her feet. She enrolled at Bunker Hill Community College in January. She's studying social work. She wants to help women leave the kind of family she grew up in. Last I heard, she was thinking about transferring to Boston University in the fall. Lily is helping her with her applications. They have lunch every Sunday. The second thing I didn't expect was the email I got from my own attorney about 4 months after the wedding. Marcus had retired by then, handed his practice over to a younger partner named Eleanor Chen. Eleanor wrote to tell me that, in the course of unrelated estate work for a client of hers, she had come across documentation suggesting that Cordelia Whitlock Crowley had a long history of similar behavior. There were at least 2 prior daughters-in-law. There may have been more. Eleanor wasn't sure I'd want to know, but she thought I might. I shared it with Lily. Lily shared it with Mallory. Mallory put her in touch with a journalist at the Boston Globe. The story ran 6 months later. I won't link it here. You can find it if you want to, but I'll tell you that the Whitlock Crowley family no longer hosts the charity gala where my daughter met Brennan, and that Brennan himself was quietly let go from his investment bank, and that Cordelia has reportedly moved full-time to the family's house in Palm Beach, where she does not, as far as I am aware, give wedding gifts to anyone anymore. Lily is doing well. She got the attending position she'd been working toward. She still lives in the Marlborough Street condo. She has a new boyfriend, a pediatric oncologist named David, who took me out for a steak dinner on a second visit to Pittsburgh and asked me very seriously what I would need to see from him over time in order to trust him with my daughter. I told him the truth. I told him I would never fully trust anyone with her again because I'd learned my lesson, but that I would respect him if he kept showing up the way he was showing up now. He thanked me. He paid for the dinner. He hasn't given me a single reason to doubt him in 8 months. Mallory comes to Pittsburgh for Thanksgiving every year now. She calls me Uncle Walt. I have not corrected her. People sometimes ask me, friends from my old engineering firm, men at my church, my brother-in-law Don when he's had 2 beers, they ask me if I regret not saying something sooner, if I should have warned Lily before the wedding, if I should have refused to walk her down the aisle. I always tell them the same thing. No, I don't regret it. Because here's what I've learned in 68 years of life. You cannot save your children by telling them. Your children have to see it for themselves. Your job as a parent is not to be the wall that protects them from every bad thing. Your job is to be the door that's always unlocked, to make sure that whenever they decide they need to leave, whatever they need to leave, they can walk out into a life you've prepared for them, even if they didn't know you were preparing it. I've built bridges for 41 years. I know how to make something hold weight. I know how to engineer something so that even when the load is more than anyone expected, the structure stays standing. My daughter is the most important thing I have ever built. I built her a way out before she knew she needed one. And on a Saturday evening in October, in a white tent on a cliff in Newport, Rhode Island, in front of 300 people, in front of the woman who tried to break her and the man who laughed while she did it, my daughter walked across that bridge. And she has never looked back. If you're a father with a daughter, or a grandfather, or an uncle, or anyone who loves a young woman in your life, please hear me. Set up the trust. Buy the small condo if you can. Put the lawyer's number in the envelope. Tell her in writing that she has a home. Do not wait until you see the bruises. Do not wait until she calls you crying. Do it now, while there is time, while the bridge is still being built. Your daughter does not need you to tell her she made a mistake. She needs you to make sure she has somewhere to go when she figures it out for herself. That's all I have to say tonight. Thank you for listening. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? My daughter and I read every comment together on Sunday mornings now, with coffee at the kitchen table in Marlborough Street. It would mean the world to her, and to me, to know who you are out there. God bless you. Hold your children close, and build them their way out while you still can. I've been thinking a lot in the months since that night in Newport about why things unfolded the way they did, about cause and effect, about the long, quiet chain of small decisions that led to my daughter walking out of that white tent in her wedding dress and never looking back. Cordelia Whitlock Crowley didn't humiliate my Lily by accident. She did it because 3 previous daughters-in-law had taught her she could. Because every time she'd belittled a young woman in front of her family, no one had stood up. No one had pushed back. The behavior got rewarded. So it grew. That's how cruelty works in families like that. It isn't a single moment. It's a pattern that's been allowed to harden over decades because everyone around it chose comfort over courage. Brennan laughed at his mother's gift because he'd been laughing at her cruelty his whole life. That was the cause. The effect was a 30-year-old man who couldn't recognize his own wife as a human being. But I think there's a deeper lesson here, and it's one I've been trying to live by since Diane died. A good life is built on 3 things, and you can't skip any of them. The first is doing what's right even when no one's looking. I funded that trust quietly for 3 years. Nobody clapped for me. Nobody knew. My own daughter didn't know. Doing the right thing in private before anyone needs you to is the foundation everything else stands on. The second is using your head. Love isn't enough. You have to think. You have to plan. You have to look at the situation you're actually in, not the one you wish you were in, and prepare for what's likely to come. I'd known what kind of man Brennan was within 10 minutes of meeting him. Loving Lily meant being smart enough to act on what I saw, instead of pretending I hadn't seen it. The third is being strong enough to actually do something when the moment arrives. Plans don't save anyone. Action does. Standing up in front of 300 people and taking the microphone from Cordelia's hand was the easiest hard thing I've ever done because the work had already been finished. The trust was funded. The condo was furnished. The lawyer was paid. All that was left was the courage to walk to the front of the room. If you're a father or a grandfather or a man who loves someone vulnerable in your life, please understand this. You don't get to pick whether the storm comes. You only get to pick whether you built the shelter before it does. Be quietly good. Be smart in advance. And when the moment comes, and it always comes, be brave enough to use what you built. That's the whole of it. That's everything I know.